Tell me about this process of going to the monastery and being the monk, and what you learned kind of in retrospect by doing that whole process, by separating from the world, and then those first few years. Because in our previous conversation, you were talking about how it was very difficult stripping yourself away from all of these kind of worldly comforts and routines you had gotten used to. Yeah. But then by doing so, it got your brain into a different space. And I think that's why people seek you out, because you come at things from a different angle and from a different perspective. And you're the first one to say, I'm not the guru, but you see things differently that we don't, because we didn't have to kind of sacrifice, I guess, in that way.
And I think the biggest thing for me is that I had such an amazing teacher. And my guru trained me remotely before I joined the monastery, and then when the first 3 years I lived with him, he trained me intensely. And unfortunately, he died 3 years after I joined, so I stayed for 7 more years. But in the 3 years that I was with him, he personally worked with me and really broke me, so to speak, broke all the patterns. And I'm not saying all the patterns, but definitely a great deal of them. And then helped me to recreate new patterns in my mind, and really taught me about my mind and how it works. And he showed and gave me tools, right? He gave me enough homework that I could reincarnate for the next 5 more lives, and I still would struggle to accomplish all the work he's given me.
What kind of tools was he doing, and how was he breaking you?
By challenging me. So for example,
and you're 23 at the time.
Yeah, 23 and a half.
Just came from Perth.
Yep.
And now you're giving the next 10 years of your life to this.
Well, I went in there for life. I never thought I would leave. My intention was to be a monk my whole life. I had no plans to leave, not be a monk. Never. So after he died, 3 years later, it was a really difficult time for the monastery. There was only 27 monks. And everybody, 2 generations of monks, and everybody came there because of him. They were seeking self-realization, or they wanted to serve, but because of him, they joined that particular monastery to be his students. So in the 52 years of teaching, he had just 27 monks with him that he knew intimately, that he trained. And when he died, it was a great loss and a real difficult period. And I think within 2 years, we lost about 8 or 9 monks left. And, I stayed 7 more years, and I felt that, our paths weren't as aligned as it was before. So my vows expired, and I chose to leave. But I had no intention ever of wanting to leave the monastery. I would be, if he was alive, I'd still be there as a monk, for sure.
Wow.
So it wasn't that I went in there, I was going to do 10 years and then leave and go travel and teach. That was never my intention.
Okay.
Yeah. So when I left, I was like, I had to do something now.
Right.
Yeah.
And so those first few years, he kind of goes to break you.
Yeah, and it's really about, he's able to, because he only had a few students, and he always wanted a few students so that he could understand you, right? If you have 20,000 students, you can't get to know them, but if you have 27, you can know each one intimately. So he got to know me, he got to understand me, he got to see my habits, my weaknesses. One thing, that he worked with me is to really teach me to be non-attached. So one way, all the monks lived in a hut that was 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet tall. So 4 walls, 2 windows, a door, just a futon mattress, a pillow, a blanket, and an oil lamp. No toilet, no electricity, no plumbing, nothing in there. And that was the big hut, right? So 3 meters by 3 meters, that was considered the big hut. And I lived in one for a few months, and then he would move me to another place. He'd move me to an office, and he says, I want you to sleep here in the meeting room. And I'm like, okay. So I rolled up my futon mattress, and I went and slept in the meeting room. And I remember a giant centipede, like about 8 inches, falling from the air conditioning. I'd sleep under the air conditioning vent because it was Hawaii, it was warm, and I wanted to be a little bit cool. I remember one fell on my chest and ran across my body. And so I'm just sleeping in the meeting room, and then I'd be there for a month with nowhere to put my stuff. I'd tuck it under a table somewhere, whatever clothes I had, robes I had. And then he'd move me into another little closet somewhere, a little storeroom, and make me sleep in the storeroom. And then he would move me to a hut in the forest, which was only 3 feet wide and maybe 7 feet deep. And it was a metal sheet that was nailed on one side and folded across and nailed on the other side. So imagine a cylinder that's cut in half lengthwise. So if I sat in there, on my butt, I'd have maybe about 3 inches between my head and the top of the roof.
Wow.
And I could crawl in and lay in it, but I couldn't sit up in it. I could sit cross-legged in it. And I stayed in there for a few months. And he just kept moving me every few weeks. That one I stayed 6 months, and then he'd move me somewhere else and move me. And then eventually I just realized, I had a few of his books, I had some beads, even in the monastery, you end up collecting little things. And after moving a few times, it's just like, I don't want any of this stuff. I just had my robes, toothbrush, I'm good to go. And then he stopped moving me.
He was teaching you.
Yes. As soon as I realized, I don't need any of this stuff in my life, and, and I didn't complain about moving again, then he stopped moving me.
Interesting.
It was really interesting because I remember us being in my office one day, and I had a little room I worked in. He called me up one evening. He had gone to the beach to edit because he was writing a book. He was driving back with a couple of monks. He called me up. It was about 6-something at night, and he says, "Dandapani, I want you to move to the wind bell for us." And that's where that little hut was on stilts, that was 3 feet high. And I said, "Oh, okay, Gurudeva, I'll move there tomorrow morning." And for him, there was no tomorrow. Everything is now. "No, you can move there now." And it was already getting dark outside, and there's no freaking lights in the forest. And I said, "It's getting dark outside." And he goes, "But you have a flashlight, don't you?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And I just hung up the phone on him and, grabbed my flashlight, ran to my current hut, grabbed all my stuff, and I went into this forest. And, there was this little tiny cylindrical hut in the forest that, I cleaned it out and had gone dusty and cobwebby because no one had lived in there for months or years. And I just pushed my things in there and crawled in there. That night you're sleeping and geckos would fall, get in there and run across your body, and, you'd scream. But if a monk screams in the forest and there's no one there to hear him, the monk scream.